The office party was abuzz with conversation and laughter, drinks flowing freely as people let loose. Stephen grabbed a whiskey from the bar, scanning the room for Linda. They had arrived together, but she had drifted off, and now he couldn't find her. It was unlike her to disappear like this. He caught sight of her at a table across the room, surrounded by co-workers, her laughter ringing out as she leaned in closer to Mr. Winston, his boss. Stephen watched them, feeling a mixture of pride and unease. Linda had always been good with people, able to charm anyone, but there was something off about this scene. The way she was sitting, the way Winston was looking at her, it didn't sit right. Stephen started towards them, weaving through the crowd, but stopped when he heard it. As he sat there with him, a strange noise caught his attention. It was a sloppy, rhythmic sound that seemed out of place amid the chatter and music. He paused, trying to make sense of it, but as he moved closer, the sound became clearer, more obscene. His heart pounded in his chest as a sickening realization dawned on him. His eyes locked on Linda, who was smiling, her hand moving under the table in a way that left no doubt about what she was doing. Stephen slowly went under the table, his stomach churning as he took in the sight. The betrayal was so blatant, so shameless. "What the __, Linda," the words burst out of him, raw and full of anger. Linda's head snapped up, but instead of guilt or shame, he saw irritation in her eyes. "Oh, shut up, Stephen. Don't disrespect me. This is so good," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. Stephen's world narrowed to that moment, to the sight of his wife openly mocking him as she pleasured his boss under the table. His mind raced, a torrent of emotions crashing into him, anger, disbelief, humiliation. But amidst the chaos in his head, a cold clarity settled in. This wasn't just an affair, it was a deliberate act of disrespect, and he wouldn't stand for it. Without thinking, Stephen's hand reached for a knife lying on the table. It was meant for the appetizers, but now it had a much darker purpose. He moved swiftly, his actions driven by a mix of fury and resolve. He stepped behind Winston, who was too engrossed in his pleasure to notice the danger looming over him. "One move and your lover will lose his balls," Stephen hissed into Winston's ear, pressing the knife against his thigh right where it would do the most damage. Winston froze, his face draining of color as the reality of the situation hit him. The room around them seemed to fade, the sounds of the party distant and irrelevant. It was just the three of them now, locked in this twisted triangle. Linda gasped, her bravado finally crumbling as she saw the knife. "Stephen, wait," she began, her voice trembling with fear. "Shut up, __," Stephen snapped, his tone cold and final. He wasn't the man she knew right now, he was something else entirely, something she had created with her betrayal. "You're going to pay for this, both of you." The words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. "Up," Stephen ordered, keeping the knife pressed against Winston's thigh as he maneuvered him out of his seat. Winston obeyed, moving slowly, his eyes wide with fear. Linda remained frozen, watching helplessly as Stephen took control of the situation. Stephen glanced at Linda, his expression unreadable. "You thought you could get away with this in front of everyone," his voice was low, but the menace in it was unmistakable. Linda shook her head, tears starting to well up in her eyes. "Stephen, shut up," Stephen's voice cut through her words like a blade. He turned his attention back to Winston. "You're going to follow me out of here nice and easy. No sudden moves, or this knife goes through your thigh, and you'll bleed out before anyone can help you." Winston nodded frantically, his usual confidence completely gone. Stephen guided him toward the exit, keeping the knife steady, his mind focused on the next steps. The party continued around them, oblivious to the drama unfolding in their midst. As they reached the door, Stephen threw one last look at Linda. "You've made your choice," he said, his voice full of finality. "Now live with it." With that, he pushed Winston through the door, leaving Linda standing alone, her world unraveling around her. Stephen's grip on the knife was steady as he backed away, dragging Winston with him. The chatter and laughter that had filled the room moments ago vanished, replaced by a tense silence. Eyes were on him, wide with shock and fear. "Everyone out," Stephen commanded, his voice cutting through the silence. He kept his gaze fixed on the crowd, his expression unyielding. "Except you two," he added, pausing for a moment. The crowd hesitated, unsure if they should move. Then, one by one, people began to shuffle towards the exit, their faces pale, whispers of disbelief passing between them. Within minutes, the room was empty, save for Stephen, Linda, and Winston. The door clicked shut, sealing them inside the now dimly lit space. Winston opened his mouth to speak, but Stephen pressed the knife harder against his side, silencing him. "Not a word," Stephen warned. "You'll do exactly what I say, or this night will end badly for you." Linda, who had been standing frozen by the table, finally found her voice. "Stephen, please, let's talk about this." "There's nothing to talk about," Stephen replied, his tone cold and unforgiving. He didn't look at her, his focus entirely on the man who had betrayed him. "You've made your choices, both of you. Now you'll live with the consequences." Winston was trembling now, the gravity of the situation sinking in. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're going to write your resignation letter," Stephen said, his voice steady, devoid of any emotion. "Effective immediately, and you're going to explain exactly why you're leaving, every single detail." Winston swallowed hard, his eyes darting to Linda, then back to Stephen. "I'll do it. Just don't hurt me." "Sit down," Stephen ordered, steering Winston towards the desk at the corner of the room. He kept the knife pressed against Winston's side as the man lowered himself into the chair, his hands shaking. Linda stepped forward, desperation in her voice. "Stephen, this isn't the way. We can work this out." Stephen shot her a look that made her stop in her tracks. He instantly slapped her face. "You don't get to talk," he said, his voice sharp. "You're going to pack your things and leave my house tonight." "Stephen, she began, but he cut her off, his tone brooking no argument. "Don't argue with me, Linda," he said, his voice low and threatening. "Or would you rather I call the police? Imagine what they'd think about all this." Linda's face drained of color, the reality of the situation crashing down on her. She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes, but she said nothing more. Stephen turned his attention back to Winston, who was staring at the blank computer screen in front of him. "Type," Stephen commanded, his tone leaving no room for hesitation. Winston sank into the chair at the desk, his hands trembling as he reached for the keyboard. His face was pale, his usual confidence shattered. Stephen loomed behind him, the knife still in his hand, its presence a constant threat. "Start typing," Stephen ordered, his voice calm but unyielding. "This resignation letter needs to be perfect." Winston nodded, his fingers fumbling over the keys as he began to type. Each word felt like a brick being laid in his own tomb. He could feel Stephen's eyes boring into him, watching every letter appear on the screen. The silence in the room was suffocating, broken only by the clacking of the keys. Stephen's eyes narrowed as he scanned the words on the screen. "Now include the part about the embezzlement," he said, his tone casual, as if they were discussing a routine business matter. Winston's fingers froze over the keyboard. "Embezzlement?" His voice wavered, his eyes wide with panic. I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't play dumb with me," Stephen snapped, his voice cutting through Winston's weak protest. "I've known about it for months. Every dollar you siphoned off, every false report. I've got it all documented. You're going to confess to it right here, right now." Winston's face contorted in despair. He glanced at Linda, who was standing by the door, her eyes red and swollen from crying. She looked away, unable to meet his gaze, realizing he had no allies in the room. Winston let out a shaky breath and resumed typing. As Winston typed, Stephen walked over to the desk and picked up the papers strewn across it. He flipped through them, glancing at numbers and reports, his expression impassive. The click of the keyboard continued, each keystroke marking the end of Winston's career. Linda watched, her breath catching in her throat with every word that appeared on the screen: the affair, the theft, the lies. Winston detailed it all, his hands shaking more with each sentence. Stephen placed the papers back on the desk, leaning closer to Winston. "Add a paragraph about how you're doing this to avoid a scandal," he instructed. "Mention how you've realized that resigning is the only way to preserve whatever's left of your dignity." Winston hesitated for a moment, his face a picture of defeat. "Stephen, please, this is too much. I'll lose everything," he pleaded. "You should have thought of that before you touched my wife and my company's money," Stephen replied, his voice devoid of sympathy. "Now, write." Winston's fingers moved again, typing out the final humiliating details of his confession. When he finished, he slumped in a chair, his energy drained. Stephen reached over, grabbed the mouse, and clicked on the print button. The printer whirred to life, spitting out the resignation letter. Stephen picked up the freshly printed letter and handed it to Winston along with a pen. "Sign it," he said, his tone brooking no argument. Winston took the pen with a trembling hand, his signature shaky, barely legible, but it was done. He handed the letter back to Stephen, who examined it briefly before nodding in satisfaction. "Now you're going to call the board," Stephen said, his voice steady. "Tell them you're resigning for personal reasons. You don't need to go into details, but make sure they understand it's effective immediately. And after you've done that, you'll send them this letter. They'll get it first thing in the morning." Winston looked at the phone on the desk as if it were a weapon. He picked up the receiver with a shaky hand and dialed the number for the board's chairman. His face was ashen as he waited for the call to connect. When the call was answered, Winston forced himself to speak. It's Winston. I'm calling to inform you that I'm resigning, effective immediately." "Yes, personal reasons. I'll send a formal letter in the morning." Stephen stood over him, the knife still in his hand, watching every word that came out of Winston's mouth. The call was brief, ending with Winston's stammered goodbye. He placed the phone back on the desk, his hand trembling. Stephen finally stepped back, lowering the knife. He didn't say a word, just stared at Winston, his expression unreadable. "Get out of my sight," Stephen said after a long pause, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. Winston didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled out of the chair, nearly tripping over his own feet as he hurried towards the door. He didn't dare look back at Stephen or Linda as he fled the room, his once powerful figure now reduced to a pitiful shadow of a man. Linda watched Winston leave, then turned to Stephen, her heart pounding in her chest. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Stephen's eyes locked onto hers, and she saw something in them that terrified her, a cold detachment, as if she were no more than a stranger to him. "I'll pack my things," Linda whispered, finally finding her voice. "Make sure you're gone by the time I get home," Stephen replied, his tone final. Linda nodded, tears streaming down her face as she realized there was nothing left to say. She turned and left the room, the door closing softly behind her, leaving Stephen standing alone in the dim light. Linda collapsed to her knees, her sobs racking her body. "Stephen, I'm sorry. Please, I'll do anything to make this right." Stephen stared at her, his eyes cold and unyielding. "Anything?" His voice was like ice, cutting through her desperate pleas. He looked down at her, the betrayal still raw in his mind. "Then leave now. Don't make me call the police." She nodded, her whole body trembling as she struggled to her feet. She opened her mouth to speak, to beg for some shred of mercy, but the look in Stephen's eyes silenced her. There was no forgiveness here, no chance of reconciliation. She realized with a sinking heart that whatever they had was now broken beyond repair. The gravity of her actions hit her all at once. Linda turned and stumbled toward the door, her footsteps echoing in the now empty room, each step heavier than the last. She hesitated at the doorway, casting one last look at Stephen. He didn't move, didn't say a word. His silence spoke volumes, and it crushed any hope she had left. Swallowing hard, she fled, the door slamming shut behind her. Stephen stood motionless, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. His mind replayed the events of the night, the shock, the rage, the cold calculation that had driven his actions. He looked down at the knife in his hand, the blade still glinting under the dim lights. Slowly, he placed it on the table, its metallic clink echoing in the silence. The room felt eerily quiet now, the laughter and chatter that had once filled the space were long gone, replaced by an oppressive stillness. Stephen exhaled slowly, his body beginning to register the exhaustion that the adrenaline had masked. He had won, he had taken control, exacted his revenge, but as he stood there alone, the victory felt hollow, devoid of any satisfaction. The emptiness gnawed at him, deepening the void that Linda's betrayal had carved in his heart. He walked over to the chair Winston had sat in moments ago, the one where he had typed out his confession. Stephen stared at the computer screen, the damning words still visible. He reached out and hit the print button again, the printer whirring to life and spitting out another copy of the letter. He picked up the fresh printout, folded it carefully, and slipped it into his pocket. Evidence, he told himself, just in case. Stephen's thoughts drifted to what came next. The resignation letter would go out, Winston's downfall would be swift and public, the board would receive the confession, and Winston would be finished. His career, his reputation, everything he had built would crumble. Stephen would make sure of it. But what about Linda? As he replayed her tearful pleas in his mind, he felt a flicker of something, pity perhaps, or maybe just exhaustion. She had begged for another chance, but there was no way back for them, not after this. The marriage was over, that much was clear. He couldn't imagine forgiving her, couldn't picture them moving past what she had done. She had destroyed everything they had, and now she was out of his life. Stephen walked to the window and stared out at the night, his reflection faint against the dark glass. He had always been a man of control, someone who planned every detail of his life meticulously, but tonight everything had spiraled out of control. And now, as the dust began to settle, he realized that control had come at a cost. He turned away from the window, his mind made up. He needed to move forward, to focus on what was next. The first step was calling a lawyer, getting the divorce papers ready. There was no point in dragging this out, it needed to be done quickly, cleanly. He would strip Linda of everything, just as she had stripped him of his trust, his dignity. But before that, he had to face the aftermath of tonight. He had to explain what happened, deal with the questions that would inevitably follow. People would talk, rumors would spread, but Stephen didn't care about the gossip. He had nothing left to lose. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door, the sound startling him out of his reverie. Stephen turned, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife again, but it was just a security guard peering cautiously into the room. "Is everything okay in here, Mr. Johnson?" the guard asked, his eyes flicking nervously between Stephen and the empty room. Stephen nodded, forcing himself to sound composed. "Everything's fine, just a little incident. It's handled now." The guard looked unconvinced but didn't press further. "All right, sir. Just let us know if you need anything." "Thank you. I'll be leaving shortly," Stephen replied, his voice steady. The guard nodded and left, closing the door behind him. Stephen looked around the room one last time, the memories of the evening still fresh in his mind. He knew this was just the beginning. The fallout from tonight would be long and messy, but he was ready for it. He had no other choice. With a deep breath, Stephen picked up his coat, folded the knife into his pocket, and walked out of the room. He left behind not just the physical space but the remnants of his former life. The door closed with a final click, echoing in the empty hallway as he walked into the night, uncertain of where the path ahead would lead but resolute in his decision to take it one step at a time. The next morning, the office was buzzing with the news of Mr. Winston's sudden resignation. Whispers circulated, filling every corner of the building as employees speculated about what had happened. Winston had always been seen as untouchable, a figure of authority and power. His abrupt departure, coupled with the shocking confession of embezzlement, sent shock waves through the company. The board had received Winston's resignation letter early that morning, and within hours, an emergency meeting had been called. The letter detailed the affair, the embezzlement, and the reasons for his sudden resignation. Panic gripped the company as the implications of Winston's actions became clear. An internal investigation was launched immediately, and the mood in the office shifted from confusion to outright fear. Stephen walked into the office, his expression calm, almost indifferent. The chaos that surrounded him was of no consequence. He had no intention of staying in this company any longer, but he needed to see the fallout firsthand. As he made his way through the familiar hallways, he passed by Winston's now empty office. The door stood ajar, revealing a space that had once been filled with the trappings of power, now stripped bare. A twisted sense of satisfaction curled in Stephen's chest. The man who had tried to destroy him was now facing his own ruin. Stephen continued walking, his steps measured, his mind focused. He knew what he had to do next. Linda was gone from his life, out of his home. He didn't know where she was, and he didn't care. She was no longer his concern. All that mattered now was closing this chapter of his life for good. He reached the boardroom where the members were gathered in a state of panic. The atmosphere inside the room was tense, the air thick with anxiety. When Stephen entered, the board members looked up, their faces etched with a mix of fear and respect. They knew Stephen was a man who had been wronged, and they were acutely aware that he held the key to their company's future. One of them spoke up, his voice shaky. "Do you know anything about this?" He held up Winston's resignation letter, the damning confession clear in every word. Stephen glanced at the letter, then met the man's gaze. "Only that he got what he deserved," he replied, his tone even, his face unreadable. A heavy silence followed his words. The board members exchanged glances, unsure of how to proceed. The implications of Winston's confession were severe: potential lawsuits, damage to the company's reputation, and the loss of trust from investors and clients. They were all scrambling to figure out how to contain the damage, but Stephen could see the fear in their eyes. They knew that Winston's fall was just the beginning of a much larger disaster. Stephen didn't wait for their response. He had no interest in hearing their excuses or seeing their attempts to salvage what was left. His mind was already made up. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Without a word, he placed it on the table in front of them. The board members stared at the paper, confusion flickering across their faces. One of them unfolded it and read the contents, his eyes widening in shock. It was Stephen's resignation letter. "I'm leaving too," Stephen said, his voice steady. "Effective immediately." The room erupted into murmurs, but Stephen silenced them with a raised hand. "Don't worry," he continued. "I'm not taking anything with me, no severance, no benefits. I'm walking away from all of it." The board members were stunned. They had expected Stephen to demand something, to leverage the situation for his own gain, but here he was, calmly severing all ties with the company, leaving them to deal with the fallout on their own. Stephen turned and walked towards the door, his footsteps echoing in the room. As he reached the threshold, he paused and looked back at the men who had once been his colleagues, his superiors. "You'll be hearing from my lawyer," he said, his voice low but firm. "I suggest you cooperate fully, for your sake." With that, he left the room, the door closing behind him with a soft click. He didn't look back, didn't allow himself a moment of doubt. The chaos he had created was now theirs to deal with, not his. Stephen walked down the hallway, passing by employees who quickly averted their gazes, too afraid to meet his eyes. He didn't care. He was done with this place, with these people. All that mattered now was moving forward, leaving behind the wreckage of the past. As he stepped out of the building and into the morning light, Stephen took a deep breath. The air was crisp, a stark contrast to the heavy atmosphere he had just left behind. For the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of clarity. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was his to walk, free from the shadows that had once loomed over him. He began walking, the weight of the night's events slowly lifting from his shoulders. There would be challenges ahead, consequences to face, but Stephen was ready. He had survived the worst, and now he was finally free. Stepping out of the building, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face, Stephen's thoughts drifted to what he had left behind. He had lost his wife, his job, the life he had painstakingly built over the years, but with those losses came a clarity he hadn't expected. The marriage had been over long before he caught Linda's betrayal, and the job that had once been his pride had become a source of pain. By walking away from both, he had shed the last remnants of a life that no longer served him. Linda had already left the house with her things, off to live with her lover, Mr. Winston. Stephen reached a small park, the kind of place he had often passed by without a second glance. Today, it drew him in. He found a bench under a tree and sat down, letting the tranquility of the surroundings wash over him. The world around him continued to move at its usual pace, people hurrying by, cars honking in the distance, but for Stephen, time seemed to slow down. He took a deep breath, savoring the simple pleasure of just being. He pulled out his phone and stared at the screen for a moment. It was full of unread messages and missed calls from concerned colleagues and curious acquaintances. He knew the news of Winston's resignation and the scandal that followed would spread like wildfire, but he wasn't interested in the gossip. With a swipe, he turned off his phone and slipped it back into his pocket. There was no need to be tethered to the past any longer. Stephen's thoughts shifted to the future. He had no concrete plans, no set direction, but that was okay. For too long, his life had been dictated by routines and obligations, by a need to maintain appearances and fulfill expectations. Now he had the freedom to choose his own path, to explore the possibilities that lay ahead. He chuckled softly to himself, realizing how different he felt from the man who had walked into that office just hours ago. He was free, and for the first time in a long while, he felt truly alive. This was his new beginning, and he was ready to make the most of it.